So good evening and welcome to Westminster College. My name is Chris Davids. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at Westminster, and I'm also the faculty fellow for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce our third event of the 2019-2020 B.W. Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture Series. In just a few moments, we will hear from Dr. Patrick Grzanka, Associate Professor of Psychology and Chair of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Interdisciplinary Program at the University of Tennessee's flagship campus in Knoxville. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we have several campus administrators and trustees who are with us in the audience this evening. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the president of the college, Dr. Bethany Dobkin. And I'd also like to recognize and welcome Dr. Tamara Stevenson, our current Chief Diversity Officer. I'm delighted to see that we have many students, staff, and faculty here in the audience, and we also have multiple community members who've decided to come and join us tonight here at Westminster, and we want to say welcome to everybody. So our presenting sponsor is the B.W. Bastian Foundation, which supports local and national institutions that benefit, encourage, and preserve the rights of individuals, promote equality for LGBTQ+ communities, and support HIV and AIDS programs. On behalf of the college, I would like to thank the B.W. Bastian Foundation for their partnership with Westminster, now in its 15th year, for making this lecture series possible. I would also like to acknowledge the following organizations for their sponsorship of our diversity lecture series as well, including Cigna, Jones Waldo, Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, and Zions Bank. So please join me in thanking all of our generous sponsors for their support this evening. I would like to recognize that we are gathered this evening on the land of the Goshute, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples. I ask that you join me in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We acknowledge their stewardship of this land through many generations. And I'd now like to welcome and introduce our tonight's speaker, Dr. Patrick Grzanka. He's trained as an interdisciplinary social scientist who works to investigate the psychosocial consequences of complex inequalities at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and he was awarded the 2018 Michelle Alexander Early Career Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. In addition, he has published 2 editions of his book, Intersectionality, Foundations and Frontiers, which is available for purchase this evening. Dr. Grzanka has served in a variety of editorial roles in academic journals, including as an associate editor for the Journal of Counseling Psychology. He holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, where he also earned a bachelor's degree from the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping details. To ensure that the lecture goes smoothly, I ask that everyone please silence their cell phones. Please also know that this lecture is being video recorded. Photography is welcome without a flash, and all photos should please tag Westminster using @WestminsterSLC or #WestminsterSLC. Finally, when you entered, you received a 1-item survey that says, "How much did the event strengthen your understanding of diversity issues?" At the end of the lecture, please answer by tearing the corner that corresponds with your answer, and we'll collect those surveys at the door from you when you leave. In addition, following Dr. Grzanka's lecture, there will be a reception with food in the foyer. Copies of his book, Intersectionality, Foundations, and Frontiers, will also be available for purchase, and Dr. Grzanka will be available to sign copies. We encourage everybody to attend. So thank you again for being with us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Grzanka.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to especially acknowledge and thank Dr. Chris Davids and Dr. Tamara Stevenson for this generous invitation to join you all in your community to talk about issues that I care so much about and that my work over the past decade really has been organized around. It's a privilege to do this. It's always an honor to be able to speak publicly about my scholarship. I think it's truly one of the greatest privileges of my job. And of course, the free exchange of ideas, even of controversial ones, is a cornerstone of our free society and one that I do not take for granted, especially in these fraught political times. I'm going to offer a talk in three parts that will begin with these confrontations that I want to explore with you. But I want to clarify something about my project. I'm going to talk about my book. The title is there on the screen, The Born This Way Wars, Sexuality, Science, and the Future of Equality, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Though the book is still in its early stages, it's really the culmination of about a decade's worth of research on sexual orientation beliefs. I want to clarify and underscore that my research is not about what sexual orientation is or what causes sexual desires. It's about what you think it is. I am not interested in figuring out if you were born straight, gay, bi, queer, or asexual, but in understanding why it is that you might believe that you were or that others were. I care about these beliefs for many reasons that I hope will soon become evident, including why certain beliefs about sexual orientation may correspond with more or less prejudicial attitudes towards LGBT people, or what I'll refer to as sexual and gender minorities. My project traces the recent past of science and the law in order to consider where we're going as a society in terms of the production and distribution of rights. I'm interested in these questions because I find them to be challenging, confusing, and terribly important for all of us. So let's begin with these confrontations. In August 2019, a new study on the biogenetic origins of same-sex behavior made international headlines and reinvigorated public discourse on the cause or etiology of sexual orientation. An interdisciplinary group of 21 scientists conducted an unprecedented genome-wide association study of 493,000 individuals' DNA to explore potential links between specific genes and same-sex behavior. Earlier studies of twins and families in the 1990s suggested a potential hereditary dimension of same-sex sexual behavior, though isolating genetic associations had been hindered by small samples and inconsistent operationalization of sexual orientation. So in contrast, lead author Andrea Gana and his team's new findings, made possible by, and this is really cool, direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing, suggested same-sex behavior has a weak, significant correspondence with at least 5 loci. These are positions on a chromosome. And that these 5 loci are linked to biological mechanisms of hormone regulation and olfaction, or smell. Gana and his colleagues' verdict reflected growing consensus around the complexity of sexual epigenetics. That is the relationship between our genes and the environment. They concluded sexuality's biological origins are still quite unclear and elusive. What I want to point you to is the extraordinary move these scientists made to foreground the ethical consequences of their findings and to self-consciously consider how to communicate these ideas effectively to the public. Now, indeed, broader public engagement was not ancillary or secondary to their work. It's baked into the design of the study, as you see on the screen there. They worked with activists, members of the public, and other researchers to figure out how best to explain this relatively complex and nuanced findings, and what this means in light of the lay public's understandings of the science of sexual orientation. And as it turns out, they were wise to do so. Reactions to the study underscore the political nature of all scientific inquiry into the origins of sexuality. The internet exploded with reports of the death of the sole gay gene because Gana's results reject the notion that a single gene determines sexuality. Others interpreted the study as vindicating long-standing gay and lesbian rights advocates' argument that sexual minorities are, in fact, born that way. But by rejecting the solitary gay gene hypothesis, others suggested Ghana's study pointed dangerously towards the idea that same-sex desires are chosen, which conservative proponents of sexual orientation change efforts, or what you probably know as conversion therapy, take to mean that they can be unchosen or prevented altogether. Other prominent scientists argued that reductionist accounts of genetic determinism can cause resentment and have unpredictable social consequences. And here's a quote from a commentary on the piece that was published in Nature. Quote, attributing same-sex orientation to genetics could enhance civil rights or reduce stigma. Conversely, there are fears it provides a tool for intervention or cure. Now, regardless of their intent, Ghana and colleagues find themselves in the center of a culture war over what makes sexual minorities who they are. And this war, so to speak, is not just about public opinion, as if public opinion isn't consequential enough. Debates about sexual orientation's causes have been integral to major legal decisions about the rights of sexual minorities. When the US Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges decision, the rights of gay men and lesbians to marry were predicated on unsettled scientific findings rather than a normative philosophical presumption of human dignity. Nonetheless, many lesbian and gay rights advocates called this a watershed moment in the fight for equality. In the majority opinion, Justice Anthony Kennedy reflected on the shifting meanings ascribed to marriage. But he based his defense of gay and lesbian rights, at least partially, on the biological permanence of sexual orientation. He said, quote, only in more recent years have psychiatrists and others recognized that sexual orientation is both a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable, end quote. While the history of marriage, Kennedy noted, is one of both continuity and change, sexual orientation is constant. The difference, according to Kennedy, is that now we recognize it for what it has always been, normal and unchangeable. Now, given that the legal basis for the decision turned largely upon due process and not on the constitution of sexual minorities as a discrete suspect class deserving protection from discrimination under the law, Kennedy's elaboration of the immutability of sexual orientation is all the more curious as it is telling. He cites the American Psychological Association's amicus brief for the case, but mischaracterizes the APA's argument. Psychologists believe sexuality is resistant to coercive change and is largely not chosen. They did not say that it is immutable, that is to say that sexual orientation does not change. And I would say, indeed, if you've ever met a college student today, you know that sexuality changes all the time. As Lisa Diamond, who was just here a couple of weeks ago, I understand, and Cliff Roski wrote recently, they're both at the University of Utah, they recently reflected in a stunning paper, the Obergefell decision is both, quote, a social artifact as well as a legal ruling. And as such, it possesses both juridical and cultural implications, potentially influencing the way that sexual minorities are perceived and perceive themselves. Just a few years earlier, actress Cynthia Nixon reflects in the New York Times on being chastised by several high-profile LGBT advocates and organizations for saying that, for her, being gay is a choice, and I want to read this. I gave a speech recently, an empowerment speech to a gay audience, and it included the line, I've been straight and I've been gay, and gay is better. And they tried to get me to change it because they said it implies that homosexuality can be a choice. And for me, it is a choice. I understand that for many people it's not, but for me, it's a choice, and you don't get to define my gayness for me. A certain section of our community is very concerned that it should not be seen as a choice, because if it's a choice, then we could opt out. I say it doesn't matter if we flew here or we swam here. It matters that we are here, and we are one group, and let us stop trying to make a litmus test for who is gay and who is not. She notes that there is no litmus test for being gay and that members of the community should not police their membership ranks. She also notes that we are, quote, one group. She later qualified her statement and identified as bisexual, which to her is not a choice, but, quote, a fact. I like that. She did say, though, that, quote, I believe we all have different ways we come to the gay community, and we can't and shouldn't be pigeonholed into one cultural narrative, which can be uninclusive and disempowering. Now, you all know that since 2012, Cynthia Nixon unsuccessfully ran for governor in New York. So her career was not over, but this was certainly an example of a high-profile flashpoint in controversy among celebrities speaking out about these issues. But there's another celebrity who you probably know better who popularized the phrase "born that way." Lady Gaga in 2011 releases a new album to huge press and mixed acclaim. Born This Way catapults her to LGBT advocates super status. She later creates the Born This Way Foundation to support gay youth, which joins Dan Savage's It Gets Better project as one of the most high-profile LGBT advocacy organizations in the United States. If Born This Way was becoming doxa before Lady Gaga, she made it into a zeitgeist. I want to briefly highlight this controversy, which broke out of the academic world and into the mainstream in summer 2012. The primary claim of sociologist Mark Regnerus's June 2012 social science research article is that gay and lesbian parents have fundamentally more unstable households than their straight counterparts, and that children of same-sex parents are more likely to be delinquent along a variety of metrics. One of the major criticisms of this paper was that in order to assess the parent's sexual orientation, the child, the adult child, was asked to identify the parent's sexual orientation in terms of whether or not they thought their parent had ever had a same-sex partner. So scientifically, this is terrible, okay? He responded, "I got taken to task for leaning on young adults' assessments of their parents' relationships. I didn't ask them whether they thought their mom was a lesbian or if their dad was gay, because in part, self-identity is a different kind of thing than behavior, and a lot of people weren't out in that era. I think we can all think of moms and dads when we were growing up that we either knew or suspected were gay or lesbian." Ooh, I mean, that's an interesting claim. But never came out of the closet, so to speak. So I didn't want to make the assumption that these young adults would identify their parents as gay or lesbian, so I kept the focus on relationship behavior. I do want to say what's really interesting about this is I personally am politically opposed to the kind of research that Mark Regnerus does, but the quote that I've put in bold is something that I might be likely to say in my class when talking about distinguishing psychologically between how one identifies and how one behaves sexually. Though the journal and the American Sociological Association ultimately conclude that the research was bullshit and never should have been published, Regnerus never relented, and he's still at it, about his findings. He did, however, qualify the way the very categories under investigation had been defined and interpreted. He told this to the ultra-right-wing anti-gay organization Focus on the Family, which highlights how he defined gay or lesbian parents in terms of past behavior, having sex with someone of the same sex, or your child perceives that you had sex with someone of the same sex, as opposed to past or present desire or identification. So I think what's important to understand here is that a flashpoint in the publication of this paper was not just that people disagreed with his conclusions, in particular about the children of lesbian and gay parents being more delinquent than their straight counterparts, was that his operationalization, how he defined sexual orientation, was considered so deeply problematic. That same year, the Grammy-nominated Same Love by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis featuring Mary Lambert became central to gay marriage advocates' campaign to pass Washington State Referendum 74, which ultimately legalized same-sex marriage in that state, and later became a popular pop song throughout the United States. Macklemore was largely embraced by his gay and lesbian mainstream as an exemplary ally. His lyrics, if you listen to the song, reflect two core themes. First, that queer love, you can guess this from the title, is not queer at all, but the same as straight love. And that sexuality is immutable, as Lambert sings in the chorus, "And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to." Now, this song, once it was nominated for a Grammy Award in 2014, became the topic of what amounted to a pretty high-profile fight between some prominent gay journalists. Writing in the New Republic, Brandon Ambrosino, January 28th, 2014, writes, in a critique of Macklemore's work, "Many people do feel as if their sexuality is something they were born with, and I have no reason to disbelieve them. But as I and other queer persons will readily confirm, there are other factors informing our sexualities than simply our genetic codes." 2 days later, Gabriel Arana responds in the same paper, "This line of reasoning has a hip, post-gay appeal, but it is eye-rollingly naive, a starry-eyed view you might expect from a college student who's just taken their first queer theory class, like with Dr. Grzanka. Those of us who support LGBT rights are committed to the Born This Way narrative, not as a civil rights strategy, but for the simple reason that it's true." You're going to hear from both of them later in my talk. But one of the things that I think is really interesting as these two cisgender gay men duke it out in a mainstream publication discussing their conflicting beliefs. Karen Tongson, a queer theorist, woman of color, University of Southern California professor, had written a year earlier about Macklemore's song, "Why does it take a white dude who phobically disavows his own fleeting homosexual identification as just another instance of buying into stereotypes to make the case for gay marriage and gay biologism on pop radio on our behalf?" And that's a publicly available post on the New York University Press blog called "Same Love or Same Old Shit?" Meanwhile, 2015, renowned neurosurgeon and Republican presidential hopeful Dr. Ben Carson at least partially tanked his campaign because of his response to the question, "Is being gay a choice?" I'll spare you the video and read you the quote. He said, "Absolutely." And can you all see that? No, it's cut off a little bit. Okay, so I gotta read this to you. "Absolutely. Because a lot of people who go into prison straight, and when they come out, they're gay." That was his answer. I am not going to say anything in response to that. So meanwhile, I want us to sit with this, because the whole point is for this to be complicated. You don't have to like Ben Carson, but listen to me. Meanwhile, only a month before, prominent gay journalist, pundit, who you might have seen on TV since then, filmed a TED Talk to set the record straight about how her controversial column in the Washington Post, in which she stated that she not only hoped her young daughter would become a lesbian, but that it was completely reasonable to do so, not unlike a sports aficionado hoping their kid would be an athlete. In the talk, which I encourage you to watch, in which she defends her position, she said, "This was, by the way, the first time I had ever gotten hate mail from gay folks because I basically said, 'Choose gay,'" as her t-shirt reads there. And to return to the scene in which I began, only months after Carson's gaffe and Sally Cohen's controversial column, the Supreme Court would offer exactly the opposite argument, that homosexuality is normal, natural, and unchangeable. Normal and unchangeable. It's what I identify as the paradox of Born This Way logic. On the one hand, this rhetoric has played an essential role in ushering in the most expansive era of LGBT rights in American history. And on the other, it seems to advocate a narrower vision of human sexuality than what is licensed by actual human diversity. My project represents an attempt to understand the cultural, legal, and scientific transformation of sexual orientation from the disorderly, iconoclastic agenda of the sexual and gender liberationists at Stonewall in 1969 to the normal, civil, and immutable legal subjects of the Obergefell decision. American public opinion about sexual minorities has shifted dramatically, not only in terms of how people evaluate them, as good or bad, as normal or deviant, but in terms of what we believe sexual orientation actually is. Whereas a small minority of Americans believed that sexual orientation was inborn in 1978, the first time Pew asked the question. According to recently nationally representative polls by Pew, Gallup, and others, a definitive majority of Americans believe gays and lesbians are born that way. While scientists have been on the hunt for what some cheekily refer to as the gay gene, inconsistent and unreliable evidence leaves the sexual orientation's scientific nature and origins elusive, a point underscored by the authors of the groundbreaking study with which I opened. Now, my point is absolutely not that Ben Carson is right or that Lady Gaga is wrong, but that these moments of debate and controversy underscore how born this way logic has become so dominant that even suggesting subtle disagreement leads to immense and immediate backlash. But what if the biology of sexual orientation mattered less than its sociality? In other words, does what we think sexual orientation is matter much more than what it may actually be? Tactics. The Born This Way wars reflect the diversity not only of attitudes towards sexual minorities today, but the various beliefs about what sexual orientation even is, how it's defined, where it comes from, what constitutes sexual orientation categories that are valid, if it can be changed, etc. Beliefs about sexual orientation are important to me in so much as they influence attitudes towards sexual minorities and vice versa. So I make a very clear distinction in my work, which a lot of psychologists would do like me. Beliefs are what you think it is. Attitude is if you like it or not, right? The attitudes are the evaluative component. The belief is the what you understand it to be. That's an important distinction here. Now, indeed, much of the struggle for lesbian and gay equality in particular has been framed in terms of sexuality's origins and its immutability. This is in contrast, however, to civil rights activism for African Americans that has historically challenged and debunked the scientific racism of the eugenics movement, as well as feminist efforts to dismantle pseudoscientific arguments about male superiority. Meanwhile, some gay and lesbian activists and straight allies have embraced biological explanations of sexual orientation as a way to advocate for equal treatment under the law, as well as for broader social or cultural acceptance. This turn to biogenetic explanations of sexual orientation has included complex maneuverings by psychologists, biologists, physicians, lawyers, politicians, activists, celebrities, scholars, and ordinary Americans, some of whom have embraced a rhetoric that we're just born this way. But the born this way zeitgeist has not been without its own controversies. Some scholars and activists have argued that the legal gains of the past several years have been accompanied by serious costs to sexual minorities and even broader understandings of equality itself. And in my book, I'm arguing that the Born This Way wars are replete with victors, casualties, tactics, sacrifices, occupations, assassinations, and crises of conscience that often accompany war. The deployments of these beliefs in the interest of attitude change, the management of public opinion, the advancement of science, and the acquisition of social and legal security represent the landscape of a war that continues to inform, even in the post-Obergefell United States, how we conceptualize sexuality, discrimination, and even broader notions of identity and inequality. We're going to get academic for a second and then zoom back out. Bear with me. Psychologists have developed a kind of theoretical mapping. This is by Zerbert, Rocher, and Shadron. It's an old paper from 1997, where they mapped out components of what they called essentialist versus constructionist beliefs, which are really relevant to how we come to think about sexuality or sexual orientation. On your left there, you see a number of categories. Discreteness, the notion that categories, this applies to all categories, but as my examples, I'm going to use sexual orientation categories. That sexual orientation categories are discrete and non-overlapping, fully different. Uniformity, that there's some internal consistency within the category. Informativeness, once I know that you're a member of that category, that tells me a lot about who you are. Naturalness, it comes from your body, not from society. Immutability, your membership in that category cannot be changed. Stability, the category itself looks the same over time. Inherence, there's a there, even though I can't name it sometimes. There's like an essence. Necessity, that there are certain characteristics that one meets in order to belong into that category. And then exclusivity, the notion that if you're in one category, in this case, like if you're a lesbian, you can't also be bisexual, or you can't also be straight. This is contrasted to constructionism, which tends to be positioned in a kind of dualistic opposition to essentialism. Constructionist beliefs tend to emphasize the unrealness, that is the sort of made-uppedness of categories, the arbitrariness of social categories, emphasizing context, the importance of thinking about where a category comes from and where and when it's being deployed. Fluidity, the notion that categories can change and also group membership in categories can change over time. Plurality, that you might belong to multiple categories at the same time. Contingency, this is sort of like, it depends. Like, you ask me if I'm bisexual, it depends, that kind of thing. contingency, arbitrariness, that what we call straight versus gay on a Kinsey scale, a phallometric test, or any other kind of scientific investigation into sexual orientation is somewhat arbitrary. A scientist is picking a line to mark and say, like, okay, well, this person, that's a straight guy who just made out with one gay guy once. He gets to be in the straight pile. But the other guy who identifies as straight, who routinely makes out with other straight men, who calls himself straight, he goes in the gay pile, right? Like that kind of arbitrary distinction. And then, of course, power. Constructionists tend to think a lot about power. Who gets to make up categories? Who gets to say who belongs in different categories? All right. Are you with me? I know that's like the jargony stuff, but I promise we'll get through it. This is from The New Yorker. Can you see the bottom line there? I can't really. Can you see it? I'm going to read it to you. Listen to me. Gender is a construct. Society is a construct. Money is a construct. But bedtime is very, very real. Now, okay, this image, it's deeply misleading, albeit funny. To suggest that something is socially constructed is not to suggest that it is not real, but rather that it is the product of social relationships, interactions, institutions, and decisions made by human beings. The value, for example, of a dollar bill is not inherent, but we all know how real it is, right? Nor is the association between pink and girls or blue and boys. These are not natural or biological, they're social decisions. So to say that sexual orientation is socially constructed is not to say that it is not real or even that it's not biological, just that social forces shape how we define it and how we understand it. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what people have found when they've thought about sexual orientation. That's whenever you see SO on the screen, that's SO beliefs, sexual orientation beliefs, and politics. On the left-hand side, essentialism. These are some examples of essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation. It's not a choice. It's biologically inherent. You're born with something that's outside of your control. Sexual orientation categories deserve equal protections. The Human Rights Campaign, the nation's leading LGBT advocacy organization, has used essentialist arguments to advocate for marriage equality, equal military service, and for hate crime legislation. Okay. On the right-hand side, constructionist arguments about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation categories are historically recent and contingent. We know that the invention of the category of homosexual happened in Eastern Europe around the year 1870 by psychiatrists who were interested in trying to legislate against sodomy laws in Europe, the criminalization of sodomy. That sexual orientation and sexual orientation categories are influenced by power relationships, by inequality. That sexual orientation is a social concept grouped to arbitrarily group individuals. Remember back the straight guy who made out with one gay guy in college versus the straight guy who is making out with straight men with some regularity but still identifies as straight. One goes in one pile, one goes in the other. That's the arbitrariness. Queer theorists like myself or the people who trained me would say that we need to deconstruct heteronormativity, this term that's used to describe how heterosexism influences how we see everything in the world as structured by heterosexuality. And these constructionist ideas were advanced by queer theorists and activists, groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 90s. But what neither of those paradigms well account for are these notions of choice or agency. Agency, or what we call agentic things, are common in the contemporary discourse on sexual orientation, and include some things like being LGBTQ is a political choice that one makes. It's not just about your desires and your behaviors, it's about your decision to be out in the world. Some folks argue that being LGBTQ is a choice that people should not make, right? That's another sort of agentic argument. You could also say, as sexual orientation change efforts insist, that if it's a choice, it can be unchosen. Choose it away. Pray away the gay. Choice acknowledges the everyday struggle of identity. So for some feminists and queer theorists, the notion of choice, like Sally Kahn, for example, earlier in the talk, for her choice is really important. It matters to her that she's allowed to use that word, choice, choose gay. Again, choice can be undone by therapy, willpower, and or faith. Now, I want to talk about some of the consequences of essentialism, which I think helps us better understand why all of this is so confusing. Essentialist beliefs about race and gender correspond with negative attitudes towards women and people of color. Some of this work has been done by Dr. Eberhardt, who was on campus earlier this semester, in a really important 2008 paper on essentialist beliefs and race. So here's an example of an essentialist belief about race. Black people are similar to one another and different from white people. That's an example of an essentialist belief. That refers to outgroup homogeneity effect, that like you all who aren't in my group are really similar to each other, but I acknowledge that there's lots of heterogeneity among my group. We're all really different and diverse. Here's another essentialist belief, this one about gender. Women are fundamentally less capable than men. We can all say like, oh, who would say that? Except people say that all the time. They just dress it up in what my colleagues in feminist STS would call neurosexism and other kinds of biologically inflected ways to say that it's just a biologically determined that women like make less than men and aren't professors of physics and not like sexism. Some essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation tend to predict positive attitudes towards LGBT people. And this is what's so weird, right? Like, it's bad and it results in prejudice when we talk about race and gender, but then when we talk about sexual orientation, sometimes essentialism seems to, maybe we'd like it. Like, if sexual orientation is innate, it cannot be judged, people can't control their sexual orientation, why are you judging them? But, here's where it gets tricky, if it's innate, it can probably be screened for and cured. Intervened in, right? And we also know that people may hold essentialist beliefs to justify negative attitudes. So this is really tricky from a directional perspective, and psychologists were very concerned with what causes an outcome. The relationships between beliefs and attitudes, which comes first, is tricky. And what some people have been able to experimentally isolate is the idea that you come in homophobic and you need something to justify your homophobia, so you use essentialist beliefs to kind of shore them up, okay? And so that's complicated there. Let's think about the consequences of constructionism on the other hand. Constructionist beliefs about race and gender correspond with affirmative attitudes towards women and people of color. Here's an example. People of color have been denied resources historically which shape life chances and outcomes. Another one. Women have been systematically denied employment. This explains differential achievement, not differences in aptitude. Aptitude would be an essentialist argument. Constructionist beliefs about sexual orientation are really not politically legible. And very famously, Lisa Dugan asked, like, how do we talk about queer theory in the public sphere? You can imagine what might happen to me if I had gone on your local news tonight and said that heterosexuality is the state-sponsored religion here in Utah. That is not going to work. It'd be fun, though. But constructionist beliefs about sexual orientation can also be co-opted by the right. And specifically, I'm talking about the homophobic right here. If it's all a construction, if it's all in your head, then why does it deserve legal protection? We don't rewrite the Constitution for your little millennial flukes, right? There's also, and this is a quintessential neoliberal position, if it's your choice, that's fine. Choose it in private. Okay? This then would place homosexuality back in the sort of pre-Lawrence v. Texas era where like you may or may not have the right to be gay in private. Some people who lodge these arguments, which are still really quite legible among right-wing pundits and activists, this privacy logic actually often equates homosexuality to abortion. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Consequences of agentic beliefs. Agentic beliefs about race are not as politically prevalent. Like, you don't hear a lot of people talking about choosing race. But there was some discourse around racial choice in census debates on multiraciality. And also in Barack Obama, like sort of what he was and what identities he chose. And then you might remember from a couple years ago, Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who was the head of her NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington, who identified as transracial and sort of chose to be black. Discourse on agency and gender is, of course, quite salient when it comes to trans issues. So we can examine lots of things like, for example, bias against trans people, or what we call cisgenderism in science. These folks say things like, well, is being trans a disorder, or is it a choice? Is it a disordered choice, for example? And lots of trans activists really want to eschew any question of whether or not trans people are choosing anything, even though lots of psychologists continue to fixate on that. We find that agentic beliefs about sexual orientation correspond with negative attitudes. Choice discourse is largely controlled by the heterosexist or homophobic right. And I note there again, this is like lots of parallels to abortion discourse. Like if you want it, you have to pay for it on your own, but we're gonna make it basically illegal in your state to get one, that kind of stuff. And sex ed, which I talked about with some of your students today. It's very, very similar. Like we're not gonna let you talk about sex in public schools, but you could talk about it in the home. It's your choice, choose it in private, not on our dime. But then, again, as we've seen, choice can be a progressive political statement. Cynthia Nixon, Sally and others. Choice also really, if we don't talk about choice, we don't think about choice, we don't understand how it is that sexual minorities choose to be part of groups and communities, which is, for a lot of people, a really big part of being queer, is the community element, the choice to be with other queer people. So I want to tell you about some of the work that I've done in this domain, some of the empirical work. Several years ago, my colleagues and I developed a survey instrument. Psychologists tend to go around the world asking people questions and to fill out surveys. And so one of the first things I did in this line of research is work with colleagues at the University of Maryland to develop a sexual orientation belief scale, or, and I love this acronym, SOBS, S-O-B-S. And I want to tell you about the 4 domains of this scale that it measures. All right, so the first is discreteness. Remember, this was an essentialist belief I mentioned earlier, that sexual orientation is characterized by clear boundaries between category groupings, and that an individual may only claim membership in one category grouping. A sample item that I would ask you to respond to if you took the SOBS is sexual orientation is a category with distinct boundaries. A person is either gay, lesbian, or heterosexual. It may reflect outgroup, and you'd say, I strongly agree with this, strongly disagree with this on a 1 to 5 scale. Homogeneity, the sameness of sexual orientation group members. Here's a sample item. There are more similarities than differences among people who have the same sexual orientation, and it may really reflect these outgroup homogeneity effects. The next domain that this scale measures is naturalness. This is the born this way stuff. 4 basic beliefs. Sexual orientation is innate and biologically based, characterized by early life fixity, like once it settles in when you're, 2, 4, 24, it's stuck. Sexual orientation is immutable, so it does not change, and it's a characteristic that's stable across cultures. So if I got in a time machine and I went to ancient Egypt, I could find a gay bar. Not really, but that's the idea. The sample item here is that biology is the main basis of an individual's sexual orientation. Finally, we have informativeness. These items emphasize the importance of sexual orientation and the sort of what we call groupiness of sexual orientation groups, or entitativity. There's no political items in this. These emphasize the knowledge and information gained from sexual orientation. I always think these items are really, in this particular part of the scale, are really interesting, because they're things that if a gay person says to me are totally fine, but if a straight person says, I'm like, that is homophobic. For example, it's usually possible to know a person's sexual orientation even without being told. Straight people don't say that. Okay, so we've done a lot of studies with this instrument to understand belief profiles. And I have done a lot of work over the past couple of years trying to move beyond some of the more reductionist statistical strategies that psychologists are traditionally trained in. What we train our students in as well is to take one variable and another variable and look at their associations between the two. Essentially, most of what we do is essentially examine correlations. These are valuable, right? They're actually quite important, and they're the foundation of the scientific method. They're what get us ultimately to tests of causality or causation. But they can often obscure dynamics. They often don't look really ecologically valid. They don't really represent how people think, because they take out of you one single score on a subscale and say, how did this correspond with this other single score over here? So I want to show you something. Nobody leave, okay? You'll get through it. Just a few statistics, okay? No numbers even. I think only sample sizes here on these slides. What we've got on the bottom, okay, is, and I don't know that you can fully see it, but what I have is 4 different points: discreteness, homogeneity, naturalness, and informativeness. That's the x-axis here, the 4 subscales that I just described to you. And on the y-axis, we have relatively lower scores versus higher scores, okay? No numbers, we're all gonna be fine. We're gonna get through it. In this first sample, this is from a 2013 study. We used this analysis called latent profile analysis. And what's so cool is that rather than just tell me what the association was between naturalness and, let's say, homophobia in my scale, I get to see kind of how people responded to all of the 4 subscales of the sexual orientation belief scale. And what those lines represent are relative patterns of responses and the groups of people that fell in to those patterned responses. So we called the group with the orange squares naturalness only. Remember that naturalness items indicate a belief that individuals can neither change nor choose their sexual orientation. A lot of people fell into this group, and they were relatively low on those discreteness, homogeneity, and informativeness scores, highest in naturalness. This is the Born This Way group. The other group with the generally higher scores on all 4 subscales, those are the blue stars right in the middle, we called those multidimensional essentialists. Now, we examined social class, gender, and race to see if membership in a particular social group might predict the likelihood of falling in either class of these responses. Very interestingly, we found that being heterosexual indicated lower probability of being in this naturalness-only group. But most importantly, the endorsement of these Born This Way beliefs did not primarily distinguish the 2 groups. So the straight people and the gay people mostly all believe Born This Way stuff together. It's the other 3 belief domains that they were different on. It was their relative endorsement of sexual orientation beliefs that these other sexual orientation beliefs that most distinguished them. Conversely, you could really describe both groups as sharing in common a belief in the innateness and immutability of sexual orientation. In this second sample of students, these were all women, we found the same 2 groups, both with shared endorsement of the Born This Way beliefs, but differing on the 3 other subscales. This time, the purple diamonds come into play, though. This is a new, small, but meaningful 3rd group of respondents. They were about 36 of them. And they were lowest in naturalness scores and highest in the other 3 dimensions. We called them high DHI, for discreteness, homogeneity, and informativeness. This time, sexual orientation did not correspond with group membership. But in this survey, we included these attitudinal measures, including a scale of homonegativity, or homophobia. And we found that higher levels of homonegative prejudice predicted membership in both the multidimensional essentialist and high DHI class. That's the 2 groups that are highest in those other belief domains. What we found, most importantly, is that everybody was the same, relatively, in these naturalist beliefs. So this Born This Way ideology that has become so dominant and then so many people think is so important to whether or not you wind up homophobic or you're advancing a homophobic agenda or you're advocating for gay rights, it seemed that everybody sort of believed that. But that what they differed on were these other belief domains. And those belief domains were much more consequential for their ultimate attitudes, their relative levels of homophobia. This was fascinating. This was super meaningful to us. And now I want to tell you, in my conclusion, how I see this continuing to play out in the public sphere. What if the Born This Way beliefs don't matter as much as these other belief domains that we barely ever talk about? And then how can we think about Born This Way beliefs more complicatedly? So one chapter of the book explores character assassination as a primary method of conflict over Born This Way ideology and how it manifests in public, including scientific discourse. I have been interviewing people who have engaged in character assassination and similar practices, or have been the targets of what I call the politics of annihilation. These incidences reveal the affective or emotional registers of the Born This Way wars, indexing the possessive investment in these beliefs, typically in essentialist beliefs about sexual orientation, and how they are always political. I'm at 42 minutes, Chris, but I'm gonna wrap it up, right? We good? Great. So, Brandon Ambrosino writes the piece, "I wasn't born this way, I chose to be gay." Gabriel Arana claps back. Macklemore is right, being gay isn't a choice, it's a civil rights issue. You remember them from before. Gay boys fighting with each other in public. Brandon comes back, what my angry critics get wrong about my choice to be gay. He takes down their arguments. Then this other guy comes in and says, "What's wrong with choosing to be gay? Hey, maybe we shouldn't get so upset about this." Gabriel Arana writes, Vox Media's decision to bring Brandon Ambrosino on board is clickbait contrarianism at its worst. That happened later that spring. So I was watching all of this, and to be honest, kind of giggling. But also, as I was thinking about the development of this book project, I wasn't really sure I wanted to write a book on this at that time, but I was thinking about it. I was sort of saving clips, frankly. I decided that I definitely wanted to talk to them about this fight. So I interviewed Brandon last year. 31, white, gay, cisgender man. He's a journalist. He was a PhD student at the time. Gabriel Arana thinks that he understands everything there is to know and how human bodies and human brains and human desires. And I mean, based on what? A Queer Theory 101 class he took in college? So I think, yeah, I always want to, you remember that that's what Gabriel said about him, but anyway. So I just think, yeah, I always wanted my impulse, and I'm a journalist. My impulse is to trust the human story and to trust the human at the center of that story. And when I'm interviewing a human and a story doesn't fit hand in glove with mine, the responsible and compassionate thing for me to do is say, oh, okay, then it doesn't have to fit because it's not about me. The irresponsible thing, and not compassionate thing for me to do is say, well, damn it, I have to make your story fit mine, and if I can't do that, then that's your fault. To put a headline on that piece and then try to ruin someone's life, that's inhumane to me. We spoke a lot about his perceptions of what Gabriel Arana was doing to him in the public sphere. And then I talked to Arana. Both of these people are lovely men who I'm a scientist. We're not personal friends, but I really enjoyed talking to both of them. They were very affable and in-depth interviews. Arana says, the ways you're allowed to talk about these things, is politically restricted. And if I say that I don't think necessarily that people are born gay or that I think that's a simplification, you will have somebody go off on you before you can clarify what you mean. My eyebrows raise. Who's that person who goes off on you? Remember again that he had just published the pieces about Ambrosino. Very often, activist types. They are the types of people who go to marches, and then we laughed. Yeah, I'd say people, I always use activist as, not quite a slur, because I have lots of activist friends. But I just know a lot of activists who don't think very much about the complexity of things, and who are very sure in their worldviews, and who don't question a lot. People who have unquestionably absorbed I don't want to call it propaganda, because a lot of it's true, but they've absorbed the messaging of the gay rights movement, the people who love Lady Gaga's Born This Way song, and who feel empowered by it, but who have probably never read a single scientific article about sexual orientation. And he goes right into the exact same critique of clickbait political analysis, low-hanging fruit to be interesting and provocative. He calls Brandon intellectually dishonest and indicative of the problem with the ways journalism rewards people. And then he critiques the lack of intellectual diversity at the New Republic, which allows this kind of stuff to get published. He says it's all these old white dudes who have this gay kid who's writing this stuff that appears to give cover to right-wing arguments about homosexuality, and it's interesting to them that it comes from a gay kid. I feel a little bit bad because I feel that I should have criticized his editors more than him, and that what I said got conflated with the internet mob who was what the internet mob was saying about him. But yeah, I still do believe everything I said. Okay, so one of the reasons why I'm doing these interviews is because I think that they're fascinating. In this one, for example, I get a radically different perspective on what this key actor in the Born This Way Wars actually believes. And it turns out that he thinks that the problem with Ambrosino isn't his beliefs, which he appears actually to share in common with Ambrosino, but it's a notion of irresponsibility, that he shouldn't be saying it in polite company, and that his words are dangerous. I want to conclude with the one person who I've interviewed thus far who has not been willing to go on the record with me, who's asked for a pseudonym in this study. Mickey Flaherty is 31, a white, queer, trans woman. Having been socialized as male and not having been socialized as female has long-standing impact that definitely shades how I interact with people and how I interact in a room, and even the depth of my analysis of a gender dynamic that's going on right in front of me. I've been slow to come to an understanding. I've had a political education about men taking up space and women being raised to not take up space, to recognize that maybe I took up too much space, right? Whereas if I had been socialized female, I think that would have been really apparent. And if I'd been socialized female and been living as a woman in college, then there would have been a real consciousness raising around that would have made me much more cognizant of it at an earlier age. Some of these things I knew in the abstract but didn't start seeing for myself and viscerally responding to until the last few years, and that's complicated. There was a controversy a couple months ago when an author, she said, I guess she's being interviewed and the question was, are trans issues feminist issues? And I guess her answer was no, or not exactly. I forget exactly what her answer was. And I didn't entirely disagree with her insofar as I was like, it's different to be socialized as female. You get a lot of other shit that comes to you if you transition, especially if you become a trans woman, especially if you become a trans woman of color. And trans issues are feminist issues. I feel completely unequivocal about that. But I also think that that socialization leaves an imprint that you know for cisgender women, and it's not necessarily there for many trans women I've met. Another reason this interview, and this is back to the quote on the screen, another reason this interview is anonymous. There are trans women who take up space like men and have no consciousness of it. That level of interaction has not been critically instilled. And you know, whatever this is like my personal observation, but I think that has a lot to do with how we're socialized, and I think ignoring that is not helpful. And this person is a very prominent trans activist. Some of you may actually know this person, and that's why the interview is anonymized, and I'll do everything to protect this person's identity. They didn't want to say who they were because they're worried that these claims about the socialization of gender and sexuality, which is the content of the interview, would be too salacious that they would ruin her career. I think that conversation and the many other heated conversations that I've had over the past 18 months and that I'll continue to do over the next year as I finish the book continue to remind me of the salience of these arguments to civil rights debates and the importance of better understanding outside of sort of the heated confrontations that we see in the public arena, what's going on here. How is science being used to buttress arguments, and how is that science being misused for political ambitions? In my book, and this is where I'll end, I'm exploring the social construction of the essentially gay person, who I call the biogenetically queer citizen, whose rights are linked to their epigenetic destiny. Though the biogenetically queer citizen's sexual orientation is their defining characteristic, we cannot understand how this person has come to be scientifically and socially without considering the rebiologization of race and gender that has been well documented across the life and social sciences. The book concludes by situating the biomedicalization of sexuality vis-a-vis race and gender to raise broader questions about how we constitute both personhood and rights. I argue that what remains at stake in the conflict over sexual orientation's nature and origins is not actually the answer to the question, are you born this way? But that can we, in the 21st century, in the era of biomedicalization and epigenetics, envision social justice and civil rights beyond technoscientific framings of desire and identity? In other words, can we even imagine a universe of sexual liberation that rejects the question of sexual orientation's origins and instead insists upon asking why we would care in the first place? Thank you very much. Are we live?
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Grzanka.
You're welcome.
So what we're going to do is we'll spend about 15 minutes with a few questions that I've prepared, where I spent some time revisiting Dr. Grzanka's book, Intersectionality, Foundations and Frontiers, and use that to inform some questions to follow up on the lecture with. And so we'll do 15 minutes, and then we'll have the reception after that. So first, what I want to do, though, is have us engage in some reflexivity. So here we have two white, queer, cisgender men who are discussing social identity and inequality. And so in your talk, you talked about the way that these debates in society are fraught for other individuals, but I'm wondering how you feel, how that relates to you and your own worldview.
It's an important question, and one that comes up a lot. I just did an interview with your City Weekly, I think it's called, the alternative weekly here in Salt Lake, and talked about how people often ask me, do you think that like your interest in this is even like potentially motivated by your own internalized self-hate? You know, is this like sort of that you want to bring up these questions because you have uninterrogated homophobia? And I think that's an important question to answer and not dismiss, actually, because these are such contentious ideas and so important to people. They're very deeply held beliefs. I'll give you an example of where sometimes I think I forget the power of even bringing up this content with folks. I teach Introduction to Women, Gender, and Sexuality at the University of Tennessee, which is an undergraduate course, and I showed the Sally Kohn TED Talk this semester alongside some readings about this topic. And later in the semester, I was reading a personal reflection by one of my students who is a sexual minority. And in the reflection essay, he said that he was really offended by the Sally Kahn video, and that he knows that he was born gay, and that this video like really was invalidating of his identity. And as an instructor, I mean, this is like a heartbreaking moment. Any professor in the room knows that this is like the last thing that you want any student to feel in your classroom, is that you've provided some content that is designed to invalidate their feelings. So I was really nervous. I contacted him. I said, I want to talk about your assignment in office hours. And he came to my office hours. I was very nervous. We shot the ship for a few minutes and then got into it. And I said, you know, I'm really upset about my behavior, because I read your essay and I thought, this is absolutely not what I meant to communicate to you by showing you this video. And he interrupts me and is like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I was not offended. I was working on the essay late, and you told us you wanted to make an argument. And so I just was like, yeah, I'll argue against that Sally Kahn woman. So I was then extremely relieved about the bullet dodged, laughed a bit with the student who was then mortified that I had been upset about what they wrote. But I do think it's a useful reminder about how, you know, I'm here as this social scientist trying to get people to disclose information to me, and then I'm wrapping it up in this book that I actually want to be controversial. I want people to think it's interesting. I want people to want to read it. And I hold a lot of power as a white male academic, and I would hate to see, and I can't control what happens to the book, but I'm being super careful, because I would hate to see, for example, in a couple of years, people using ideas in the book to make arguments against sexual minority civil rights. I would hate for things to be misconstrued, but you saw that flag that I put up in the very first slides about like gay gene study says like no evidence. I mean, that shit was online the next day after the Nature story dropped, and that's a gross misreading of the science, a misrepresentation of the science to advance a political argument. So I think this stuff is fraught for sure.
So I'm curious to ask you whether you believe science is equipped to examine how sexual identities are the product of heterosexism. And so what are some other forms of inquiry that you think might be more equipped to be able to create these types of knowledge?
That's a really good question. I'm not going to give a 15-week lecture on queer theory and the origins of sexual categories here, but one of the things that we know from historians and sociologists is that scientists created the categories that we view to be sort of universal and universally applicable and having existed through time and space relatively recently in human history, and that they've changed a lot even within the time that we've had them. The invention of the homosexual, for example, begat the invention of the heterosexual as a kind of species, an empirical object to be known through the life and social sciences. Most contemporary social science and life science is not really equipped to answer questions about power the way that artists and humanists and more critical and interpretivist scholars, as well as non-scholars, people outside of universities, are equipped to think about what categories mean. I think that we learn a lot from our society by understanding that it's geneticists in the pages of Nature and Science and the New England Journal of Medicine who we look to for answers about our own selves. Like that it's scientists, other people in most cases, and if you're not a scientist yourself, it's other people's inquiry into bodies that we think possesses a kind of finite truth above and beyond our own lived experiences of those bodies, of those desires, and of their behaviors. One thing that I will say about the Ghana study that I thought was really cool is that sociologists and bioethicists were on that team, that 21-person team of scientists, and I think that's really great. I think it speaks to the sensitivity with which they approach the topic. But I say, like, why don't we ask an artist what it means to be gay as much as, like, for every time we ask a geneticist? Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how you think science and the scientific method may reinforce the notion of compulsory heterosexuality, or maybe saying a little bit differently, how is it that you believe intersectionality as a framework can help move us beyond having heterosexuality be presumed?
So compulsory heterosexuality is this really classic idea in queer theory, Adrian Rich, of sort of that helps us understand that one of the ways that heterosexism as a informal social institution manifests in everyday life. And everyday micro interactions is that everyone is presumed straight until otherwise, right? Until there's evidence of, usually you don't like discover someone's gay because you see them having gay sex. It's that you, usually, it's that you see them engaging in gender non-conforming behavior, right? So they fail at gender and then you say, and you think that they're gay. That's what compulsory heterosexuality helps us to get at. Science. I mean, science isn't a monolith, right? So we want to be really careful about like sort of using capital S science and making all of science the same. But yet, you know, scientists, there are different aims and objectives of different kinds of knowledge projects. And sociologists of science, I think, are really well equipped to talk about sexual categories in ways that don't reproduce heterosexism or compulsory heterosexuality. I'm not so sure that geneticists are, which is why I think in that interdisciplinary team led by Andrea Gana, they invited so many non-biological scientists to the table so that we can think about what it means to, in the 23andMe study, that's where lots of the data came from. Sexual behavior was a dichotomous variable of 0 for no, 1 for yes, I've ever had a same-sex partner. So that's useful because there were 500,000 respondents, but incredibly limited as a variable if we think in terms of validity, especially when we see that in 2019 there's an enormous number of people who are more willing to admit than ever on surveys that they've had same-sex attractions, desires, and encounters in their lives. Now, this is not the same as saying that like everybody's becoming gay or that like soon everyone will have same-sex encounters all the time. That's not what people are arguing. But it is about thinking about the social contingency of these categories and all the things that influence like how people even understand what constitutes sex or what constitutes a same-sex interaction. When we probe deeply into these things, we find that it's a lot more messier than it seems. And I think that it's people in the humanities and social sciences who tend to be, because they're trained to be, a little bit better equipped to think about the role of history and power in the constitution of these categories that oftentimes in the sciences we take for granted a bit. You know, we put the gay guys in this box and the lesbians in this box and then the bisexuals in this box and then we remove them from the study. That's sort of how that goes. Right. Yeah. Sorry. You want to be counted, don't say you're bi.
Yeah. Well, it also makes me think too about the ways that we, who we're placing in positions of power, such as editors of journals. So, like, I'm thinking of like the Journal of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, having Dr. Gallupo just be appointed as the editor to that journal. Like, that's going to drastically change the type, the expectations around how people are publishing, the ways that they're measuring things, and also the willingness. I mean, I'm making some predictions. I've never asked Paz directly, but you know, the willingness for you know, what's considered rigorous in the journal.
Totally. No, I mean, I think that's a really important point. And like, the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity is a really important journal published by the American Psychological Association, now led by a bisexual woman of color who does trans research. And there's going to be inevitably a kind of openness, because one of the ways that research on sexual fluidity, like the work that Lisa Diamond does at the University of Utah, sexual fluidity, sexual hybridities, plurisexuality, all these complicated things, words that like did not exist when I got my PhD, and I am not that old.
He also got his PhD at like 23. No.
Yeah.
25?
Yeah, something like that. It's 25. But I did, like, we didn't know that. Like, we didn't know the terms because they didn't exist. And now they exist, and just because they're new doesn't make them not real. It doesn't make them any less real or important if we want to understand human sexuality than the words gay and straight were 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 40 years ago. And so one of the ways in which that work that's happening at the frontiers of sexual orientation categories, which is largely being led, to your point about intersectionality, by scholars of color, that work is easily marginalized in the scientific mainstream when they say, like, well, these categories, we've never published anything on this before. Send that to a sex journal, or send that to a race journal. if we get people of color, trans folks, sexual minorities who don't identify as typical categories into these positions, this isn't just about representation and identity politics. It is about those things, but it's also about the downstream consequences of that. When people who are more open to complex research with complex questions and complex methods and complex answers, that stuff will get published, and then it becomes part of the knowledge archive too. It gets validated by important power centers, and that's really central, I think, to the transformation of knowledge production. It can't just be guys that look like us doing all of the knowing, because we don't know everything.
So I'm going to ask one more question before we have a farewell from Dr. Stevenson. So in your book, Intersectionality, Foundations, and Frontiers, there's a portion where you state intersectional analyses work to understand systematic patterns of discrimination, exploitation, privilege, and disinvestment. So I'm wondering if you can clarify a little bit of what that means and why that matters in terms of understanding the science of sexuality.
Can I see that real quick?
Yes.
I'm like, well, I wrote that. Yes. So I think intersectionality is essential. I'm really privileged to have the chance to talk to your faculty about this tomorrow. Intersectionality describes is a Black feminist and women of color framework that's used to understand complex inequalities. That is, inequality that exists at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression or advantage. The reality is that psychologists and sociologists and economists, social scientists are well trained to carve up the universe into neat empirical slices. We say, white people over here and people of color over here, cisgender people over here, trans and non-conforming people over here, or non-binary people over here, straight people, gay people, et cetera, so on and so forth. But the reality is that we all occupy multiple identities at the same time, and those identities influence how we experience systems of inequality. And so I'll just paraphrase this I think it's Kimberly Crenshaw, who's credited with first publishing the term in an academic journal in 1989, said, when we think about Black women, sometimes they experience discrimination in ways that's very similar to white women. That is sexism, sex-based discrimination. Sometimes Black women experience discrimination in ways that's very similar to Black men. That is racism. Sometimes they experience discrimination in ways that represent the kind of compounded or additive effects of racism and sexism. But sometimes Black women experience discrimination as Black women, not as the derivative of Black men's or white women's experiences. And this insight has been profound over the last 35 years for exposing how so many of our social institutions, despite the human cultural diversity that is the United States, have been so ill-equipped to even see or account for people who sit at the nexus of inequalities, like Black women, like queer people of color, et cetera. And so what intersectionality helps us to do is see that even when we're not talking about race, race is there, that organizations are racialized even when they're only occupied by white people, right? That we can understand that that gender dynamics can be really salient even if we don't have women or trans people in the room. And that we have to think about race and gender and social class together as producing experiences, co-creating experiences. This isn't just in the interest of making things more complicated, it's in the interest of being more honest about how things actually are. And so if we take an intersectional perspective, as towards the end of my talk, was really sort of turning the volume up on that, I think we better know the world, and if we can understand the world better, we can understand the complexity of human experience and complex social processes, then we're much better equipped to intervene in them, to make them better for people. Because if we design things solely based on these kind of prototypical subjects, like if we're talking about gender, we think white middle-class woman, or if we're talking about race, we think middle-class black, straight, cis man, then all of our interventions designed to ameliorate racial inequality or gender inequality are only going to advantage members of those prototypical groups, and everyone else is going to get left behind. So I think intersectionality is not only important to understand the complexity of human experience and the people who get left out of analyses that aren't intersectional, but it's so important in designing interventions that can create a more equitable future.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Dr. Grzanka, for being here. We're delighted to have you.
This was fun. Thank you so much.
So please, can we give another round of applause to both Dr. Grzanka and Dr. Chris Davids for what we were able to experience tonight. I have so many questions. I wish you could stay longer. And, and again, we thank you for taking time out tonight to join us in our third installment of this year's Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture Series. I think every lecture we've had here this year has just, the standard has been raised, and it's just been phenomenal. I think even tonight's topic just epitomizes the work that we want this series to be, and that is to address relevant, timely topics in ways that challenge us, hopefully that affirm us, and hopefully prompts us to think more thoughtfully about how we exist in the world and how we interact and exist with each other. I'm so delighted to have been a part of this, and thank you for easing our, at least my, quantitative mind when you kept saying, it's not numbers, and I was still like, so thank you for being so sensitive to that, and apparently I wasn't alone. So I'm flipping because Dr. Davis has prepared me really well, but I'm flipping pages. Okay, I'm just have to wing it. Okay, before you go, please remember to fill out the one-item survey that you received at the beginning of the event and turn it in at the table, or you can give it to me. I don't care. We just need to know your thoughts and opinions about tonight's event. Thank you to the sponsors of our series, including our title sponsor, the B.W. Bastian Foundation. Please consider joining us for our next event in January. It'll be a live KRCL remote radio broadcast commemorating Dr. King, Thursday, January 16th, from about 6 o'clock to 7:30. After submitting your survey, we hope you'll stay and join us for a reception with appetizers, and also the book will be available that Dr. Grzanka will be signing. Thank you again, and have a safe ride home. Good night.